The signal came back empty. Not jammed, not corrupted, not delayed by the 17 light-minute lag the Varath Empire's deep-range arrays always suffered at this distance from the galactic rim. Empty, clean, as if the sector of space where 43 Varath warships had been operating simply decided without negotiation or announcement to stop containing them. Admiral Sethak Vorin reviewed the return data for the fourth time in as many hours. His secondary clerk, a young analyst named Thessel, stood at the edge of the operations deck with her tablet pressed against her chest, not speaking because she had already said everything she knew twice over, and saying it a third time would not change the numbers. 43 ships, 7,400 crew, gone in the time it took to receive a routine confirmation ping. Navigation error, Sethak Vorin said finally. Simultaneous fold malfunction, get me the probability. Thessel hesitated. I already ran it, sir. And, she held out the tablet. He did not take it. She lowered it slowly. There is no probability value the computer will assign, she said. It returned a notation instead. She cleared her throat. It said this outcome is not possible under known physical parameters. Sethak Vorin was quiet for a very long time. The operations deck hummed around him, dozens of analysts pretending not to watch their admiral's face while watching it intently. Outside the viewport, the stars hung exactly where they always had, indifferent and bright and utterly unhelpful. Find out where they went, he said. What nobody in that room said aloud, what nobody allowed themselves to fully think, was the question that had been living in the silence since the moment the signal came back empty. It wasn't where did they go, it was something smaller and much more terrible. Did something send them somewhere, or did something simply end them? And underneath even that, quieter still, pressed down beneath layers of professional composure and institutional training, how did we not see it coming? The sector the Varath called Outer Survey Grid 11 had been classified as uninhabited for roughly 200 years, which was not a very long time by Varath standards, but was long enough that the classification had stopped feeling like a conclusion and started feeling like a fact. The species catalogued at the system's third planet, small, bipedal atmospheric breathers, a technological index placing them several centuries behind even basic fold travel, had been monitored occasionally, checked periodically, and largely forgotten. They had wars. They had disease. They argued with each other in ways that Varath sociological models found deeply inefficient and only marginally interesting. They appeared to be doing what pre-fold civilizations did, existing slowly, making incremental progress, occasionally threatening each other with weapons that by Varath standards were charming in their limitation. The Empire had not ignored humanity. That is important to understand. Ignoring something is a choice made in awareness. The Varath had simply categorized humanity, filed them correctly, and moved on to things that required attention. The monitoring station assigned to Earth, a small automated platform named in the Varath bureaucratic style Survey Post 11C3, dutifully collected atmospheric data, population estimates, and electromagnetic broadcasts for 212 years. Its reports were filed. Its reports were read by someone whose job it was to read such things. Its reports generated no flags. The last flag Survey Post 11C3 had generated was 119 years ago when the humans detonated their first nuclear device. That had prompted a brief review. The review concluded, pre-fold species achieving fission capability, standard developmental trajectory, no intervention required, continue monitoring. Standard developmental trajectory. That phrase would later become the subject of a 1,700-page internal Varath inquiry, and the review committee member who wrote it would not survive the political consequences of what that phrase failed to anticipate. But that was later. 3 weeks before the fleet vanished, Survey Post 11C3 went offline. Thessel found this in the records 12 hours after Sethak Vorin's order. She stared at the timestamp for a long time before she walked to his office. When she told him, she was careful to use neutral language to keep her voice level, to present it as information and not as the specific flavor of cold dread that had settled in her lower chest the moment she saw the date. The monitoring station went offline 22 days ago, she said. Routine malfunction. It's logged as a maintenance backlog issue. There are 400 stations ahead of it in the repair queue. Sethak Vorin looked at her. You're telling me we lost sensor coverage of a native species home system 22 days ago? Yes, sir. And our fleet disappeared 17 days ago. Thessel said nothing. The math didn't require her help. Pull everything the station collected in the 6 months before it went offline, Sethak Vorin said. Everything, population data, electromagnetic signatures, thermal readings, everything. I already submitted that request, she said. That's what I wanted to tell you, sir. She paused. There's a problem. He waited. The last 6 months of data are irregular. The station was having calibration issues, so most of it was flagged as unreliable and deprioritized for manual review. She set her tablet on his desk. But I pulled it anyway, and the thermal readings, she stopped, tried again. The thermal readings suggest the humans had significantly more industrial activity in the outer system than our population models predicted. How much more? She thought about how to say it. She had been thinking about how to say it since she found it. By a factor that suggests we may have been wrong about something fundamental, she said carefully. Not about their technology, about their scope, about how much of what they were doing we were actually seeing. There it was, the first real crack, not in the hull of anything physical but in the comfortable shape of what the Verath believed they knew. Sethak Vorin picked up her tablet. He looked at the numbers. He set it back down. Get me every electromagnetic broadcast from that system in the last decade, he said. And get me someone who can translate their languages. Commander Uemori had been aboard the Persistent Horizon for 19 months when the Verath fleet arrived in the outer system and began what their own protocols would have classified as a survey sweep. She had been aboard it for 3 months before that, doing the kind of pre-operational work that doesn't have a clean name: inventory, calibration, the thousand small corrections that turn a vessel from a construction achievement into something that functions as a weapon when it needs to. She was not, by any definition that would have made sense to the Verath, a military genius. She was 37 years old, originally from Osaka, with a postgraduate background in logistics and a secondary specialization in psychological operations that she had pursued because her commanding officer at the time told her it would look good on her record, not because she had any particular vision for how it would one day be used. She had a brother she spoke to when communications allowed. She had a fear of confined spaces that she had learned to manage rather than eliminate, which was relevant because the Persistent Horizon contained many small corridors and no windows except on the command deck. She had at various points in her career doubted whether any of this would matter, whether the program was real, whether the plan was sound, whether the scale of what humanity was attempting was a genuine strategic achievement, or simply the most expensive miscalculation in human history. 19 months in, lying in her bunk on a vessel the size of a small moon that no Verath sensor array had ever pinged as anything other than a dense mineral formation in the outer asteroid belt, she had mostly stopped doubting. Not because the doubt had been answered, but because doubt, she had found, was a resource like any other. You spent it where it was useful. You conserved it where it wasn't. What she had instead of doubt, in the particular darkness of her quarters at 300 ship time, was a careful, quiet attention to what was coming. She knew the Verath fleet was there. They all did. The Persistent Horizon's passive sensor suite, developed over 11 years in a program so classified that most of the engineers who built it were told they were working on something else, had been watching the 43 ships the moment they entered the outer system. Watching and recording and saying nothing. No active signals, no electromagnetic leakage. The ship's hull was designed to absorb rather than reflect at every frequency the Verath used for active scanning, and the thermal management systems ran at a cost in crew comfort that had caused 14 formal complaints in the first month and a settled, grim silence in the months since. The ship was cold. It was always cold. Mori had learned to sleep in 2 layers and keep her hands near her core. What she had not told the crew, what she had not been authorized to tell them, was what the mission profile said would happen when the Verath survey fleet finished its sweep and moved toward the inner system. She knew. Captain Aldrin knew. 3 senior officers knew. Everyone else knew their station, their role, their specific function in an operation that had been planned across 11 years and 3 administrations, and more dead ends and revised frameworks than any of them had the clearance to fully count. They knew what they were supposed to do. What no plan could tell them was what it would feel like to do it. The Verath fleet spent 4 days in the outer system before beginning its inward transit. Sethak Vorin received their reports in real time from his command position 18 light hours away, relayed through the Fold comm network that was one of the Empire's genuine engineering achievements. The reports were uniformly unremarkable, asteroid composition consistent with previous surveys. Gas giant atmospheric readings unchanged, no anomalous contacts, no evidence of technological development beyond the inner planets. The fleet's sensor officer, a careful and experienced technician named Perv, noted one minor irregularity in his daily digest: a gravitational density reading in one section of the outer belt that ran approximately 4% higher than the predictive model suggested. He attributed it to accumulated drift in the surveying instruments, a known issue with long deployment arrays. He logged it as a calibration note. He did not flag it for command review. This was not a failure of protocol. Perv was doing exactly what his training told him to do with data that fell within the margin of normal instrument variation. He was careful, he was thorough. He was wrong in the specific way that thoroughness can be wrong when the category of error it's trained to catch is not the error that's actually present. The fleet moved inward. Mori watched them on the passive array and said nothing and waited. On the 3rd day of the inward transit, one of the junior analysts in Sethak Vorin's command center brought him a translated fragment from a human radio broadcast. It was 7 years old, found in the backlog of electromagnetic data that Survey Post 11C3 had collected and filed, and that nobody had looked at carefully enough. The translation was rough, done by an automated system that had been trained on a corpus of human communications large enough to handle general meaning but not nuance. The fragment was from something the humans called a news broadcast, which the Verath understood as a form of public information distribution. The fragment read, "Unprecedented scale of the construction project, which officials continue to decline to publicly confirm, has led to speculation in independent defense analysis communities that the scope of what is being built in the outer system significantly exceeds what would be required for any conventional defensive posture." When asked whether this represented a shift in human strategic doctrine, the spokesperson said only that humanity had made a decision about what it was willing to invest in its own future. Sethak Vorin read it twice. He called Thessal. He asked her to find more. She told him she was already looking. She told him the backlog was large and the translation queue was backed up. She told him it would take time. He told her they might not have it. He was right. But he didn't know yet, in the specific way he would need to know, that the timeline had already passed the moment where time was the operative variable. The persistent horizon was not, technically, a warship. This is not a semantic point. It was a genuine architectural distinction that the engineers who designed it had insisted upon, over the objections of the military officers who funded it, on the grounds that what they were building required a different set of priorities than a warship's design optimized for. A warship was built to fight. What they were building was built to be present, to exist, fully and completely, in a way that changed the tactical reality of any engagement within its operational radius before a single weapon was deployed. It was the size of a small moon. Its hull displaced approximately 2.7 billion tons. It carried a crew of 41,000, and those crew members had been selected, trained, and psychologically evaluated across a process that the program directors internally compared, not entirely in jest, to selecting a species. They weren't looking for warriors. They were looking for people who could sustain psychological coherence under conditions of extreme isolation, extreme cold, extreme uncertainty, and the specific variety of existential weight that comes from knowing you are the only thing standing between a civilization, and an outcome that civilization has been quietly, methodically preparing to avoid for 50 years. 41,000 people. Living inside a rock in the dark for 19 months, cold, watching an Empire's fleet move toward their home system, waiting for an order that everyone aboard understood was not going to feel like a victory when it came. Maury was on the command deck when the order came. Captain Aldrin read it twice, which he always did with orders of this category, not because he needed to reread it but because the second reading was for himself rather than for comprehension. Then he looked at Maury. She was the XO, she was the one who would translate the order into the specific sequence of actions that would make it real. Active profile, Aldrin said, "On my mark." Maury thought about her brother, she thought about the cold, she thought about the specific weight of 19 months of waiting and what it felt like to put it down. Active profile, she confirmed. "On your mark." What happened next from the perspective of the Verath fleet was not an attack, it was an experience. There was no preceding engagement, no weapon impact, no visible aggressor. There was simply the moment before and the moment after, and the moment after was different in a way that the Verath tactical doctrine had no framework for processing. The persistent horizon went active. Every passive system became an active one simultaneously. The hull, which had been absorbing radiation for 19 months, began broadcasting across every frequency the Verath sensors used. The thermal suppression systems disengaged, and the true heat signature of a vessel running 41,000 human beings and their support infrastructure at full operational capacity became visible to every sensor in range. The gravitational footprint, which Perv had noted as a 4% anomaly and logged as a calibration error, resolved into its actual shape, the unmistakable signature of an object with a mass measured in billions of tons, sitting 30 kilometers from the fleet's current transit path, present and impossible and already exactly where it needed to be. The Verath fleet had 43 ships. The persistent horizon was the size of a moon, but that was not what destroyed the fleet. That is the part that requires care in the telling, because the scale alone is not the explanation, and the scale alone was not what Sethak Vorin, 18 light hours away, spent the next 3 weeks trying to understand. Admiral Velkareth commanded the fleet. She was experienced, highly regarded, and in the first 30 seconds after the Persistent Horizon's active systems came online, she did exactly what her training and experience told her to do. She assessed, she calculated. She recognized the size disparity and the impossibility of what she was seeing. She opened a communication channel. She hailed the vessel. This was tactically coherent. The Verath doctrine for encountering a previously unknown asset of overwhelming scale was not immediate engagement, it was communication and assessment. You do not fire on something you cannot defeat. You talk to it while you gather the information required to determine your actual options. The persistent horizon did not respond. It did not, in the technical sense, do anything. It simply existed fully and completely in a way that filled every sensor on every Verath ship with data that their systems spent the next several minutes trying to process and categorize. Velkarath hailed it again, no response. She ordered her fleet into a defensive dispersal pattern, sensible, trained response. The ships began to move. And here is where the Verath made their first interpretive error, and it is important to understand it as an interpretive error rather than a tactical one because the distinction is where the fear eventually came from. The fleet dispersed. The persistent horizon did not follow or intercept. It did not move at all. The Verath read this as passive, as the vessel either being automated, non-aggressive, or unable to maneuver at its scale. Velkarath, completing her assessment, began formulating a withdrawal plan. She was good at her job. She recognized when an engagement was not winnable. She was going to do the professionally correct thing, pull back, report, and let people above her pay grade determine the response. She was not given the opportunity to be professionally correct because she had misunderstood what she was looking at. The persistent horizon was not a weapon system, it was a position. And the thing about a position, as opposed to a weapon, is that what it denies is more important than what it deploys. The fleet could disperse all it wanted. In dispersing, each individual ship had moved to a location in space that had already been mapped, modeled, and incorporated into the operational planning of a vessel whose passive sensor suite had been watching them for 4 days. Every position the dispersal pattern could produce had been anticipated. Not because human tactical AI was superior to Verath tactical doctrine, it wasn't, but because 11 years of mission planning, conducted by people who had the specific human advantage of being absolutely unwilling to stop revising their models, had produced something that Verath planning hadn't: a map of every place the fleet could go that was drawn before the fleet got there. What the persistent horizon deployed was not weapons fire. What it deployed was information, and the specific devastating consequence of that information being delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right recipients. Mori watched it happen from the command deck. She watched the fleet's dispersal pattern resolve into the exact shape the planning had modeled. She watched the targeting solutions update in real time. She watched Aldrin give the order she had known was coming and had not, until the moment he gave it, fully felt the weight of 43 ships. She thought about the crews. She thought about it even as her hands moved across her station, confirming the engagement parameters, because that was the thing about her that the Verath, even later, even after they had assembled as complete a picture as they could manage, never quite understood. She felt the weight of every decision she made, not because it slowed her down, because she had learned across 19 months in the cold that the weight was the point. That carrying it was what made the decision mean something. That a species capable of separating its actions from its sense of their cost was a species capable of anything, and she had never wanted to be anything. She had wanted to be someone who knew what she was doing and did it anyway, which is a different thing and a harder one. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. What Sethak Vorin received 18 light hours later was not a battle report, it was a cessation. The fleet's fold comm units had been transmitting routine status updates on a standard interval. The interval passed. The next transmission did not arrive. The interval passed again. He waited for 6 hours before he accepted that waiting was no longer a functional response and began the process of determining what had happened. The determination took 3 weeks and was never fully complete. What he was able to reconstruct from the partial data that fold comm relays in the region had captured before they too went offline, quietly, one by one, in a sequence that only resolved into a pattern when you laid all the timestamps together, was the following. His fleet had encountered an asset of unknown provenance and unknown origin. The asset had been present in the outer system without detection for a period that could not be precisely determined, but appeared to be based on the gravitational drift modeling that Thessel had done with 3 other analysts working around the clock at least 2 years, possibly longer. The hull composition, what they could determine of it from passive reflection analysis, incorporated materials consistent with the asteroid belt in which it had been hiding, suggesting either extraordinary engineering or extraordinary patience or both, and the distinction was becoming, for Sethak Vorin, less meaningful the longer he spent on the question. His fleet was gone. The asset remained. It had not moved. It had not followed. It had returned, as far as any sensor could determine, to silence. This was the second interpretive error, and it was the one that cost the most time. Sethak Vorin, looking at the data, concluded that the persistent horizon had gone dark again because it was damaged or depleted or waiting for resupply. He concluded this because it was the logical conclusion. An asset of that scale running a full power engagement would require significant resources to sustain. He built a plan around this assumption. He began assembling a second fleet larger, with specific capabilities matched to what he thought he understood. He communicated to the Imperial High Command that the situation was recoverable. He believed this. He believed it for 11 days. Then Thessel walked into his office with her tablet and her careful voice and the specific posture she had developed for delivering information that was going to change everything again. I found more broadcasts, she said, from the humans. The backlog had additional material. I've been going through it with the translation team. She set the tablet down. He looked at it. This one is 12 years old, she said. It appears to be an internal debate, some kind of recorded proceeding. The translation is partial, but she waited while he read. The fragment was long. It contained technical language that the translation system had rendered approximately with uncertainty flags on specific terms, but the shape of it was clear. It was a debate about the program, her program, Maury's program, the Persistent Horizons program. It was a debate that had happened 12 years ago in a room somewhere on Earth among people arguing about whether to do this, whether it was possible, whether the cost was acceptable, whether it was right. People arguing both sides with genuine conviction. People afraid of the scale of what was being proposed and also afraid of the alternative. People making in real time the specific human calculation that the Verath had never developed a model for because the Verath had never needed to make it. Not can we afford this, but what is the cost of not doing it and which cost can we live with? The fragment ended mid-sentence. The translation system noted that the remainder of the recording was unavailable in the retrieved data. Sethak Vorin set the tablet down. How long have they been building it? He asked. Our best estimate is 50 years, Thessel said. Possibly longer. The thermal data we had before the station went offline. When I work it backward through the population models, the industrial output required. She stopped. It wasn't one ship, sir. The construction alone required a significant portion of their planetary economy. For decades, he was quiet. A species at their technological level, he said slowly. Diverting that much resource. For how long did we have active monitoring? 212 years. And at no point did the station flag it as anomalous, sir, because the individual data points never crossed the threshold for concern. Population growth, industrial output, resource consumption, each metric looked at in isolation registered as within the expected range of a developing civilization. She paused. It was only when you looked at all of them together over time and asked what they were building toward that you see it, he finished. Yes, sir. He thought about the fleet. He thought about 7,400 crew. He thought about Velkarath, who had done exactly the right thing and what exactly the right thing had looked like from the outside. He thought about the humans who had spent 50 years building something in the dark and then waited cold and quiet for someone to need it to be real. What else don't we know? He asked. Thessel hesitated for the first time. In all the weeks of delivering increasingly terrible information, she had never hesitated before answering him. He noticed it. Tell me, he said. The broadcasts I found, she said. The debate, the 12-year-old recording. She was choosing her words very carefully. It wasn't about whether to build the Persistent Horizon, he waited. It was about whether to build more than one. Maury was in the corridor outside the command deck, her back against the hull, her hands pressed flat against the metal when Aldrin found her. She had been there for 2 hours. The hull was cold and she pressed her hands against it anyway, feeling the particular temperature of a ship that had stopped pretending to be a rock and was now simply fully itself. We have new orders, Aldrin said. He stood next to her without touching the hull because he had never developed her habit of it and found it slightly disconcerting. They want us to move to holding position at the inner system boundary. Displaying, she said, not asking, confirming. Displaying, he agreed. They want the Verath to see us. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, we lost 9 people in the engagement. Engine compartment overheat. The thermal management rebalancing after we went active. I know, she said. She had read the casualty report at 400 and then lay in her bunk until 600 not sleeping. I read it. The memorial is at 1800 ship time. I'll be there. He left. She kept her hands on the hull. The metal was the same temperature it had always been and she had grown accustomed to it, and the familiarity of it in this specific moment was something she held onto carefully, the way you hold onto things when the ground has just shifted under you and you need something that hasn't moved. 9 people. In an engagement that had ended 43 ships and their thousands of crew, she thought about proportions. She thought about what the Verath, wherever they were receiving their data, would calculate from those proportions. She thought about what they would conclude. She thought about whether they were wrong. The Verath High Command received Sethak Vorin's full report 29 days after the fleet's disappearance. They received it in a session that was classified at the highest level, attended by the 17 members of the Imperial Strategic Council, and the session lasted 11 hours, at the end of which the Council had produced 3 formal conclusions and an informal one that was not entered into the record. The formal conclusions were: That the Varath Empire had suffered an unprecedented loss to a previously uncatalogued military asset operated by a pre-fold civilization, that the asset represented a significant threat to imperial security in the outer survey regions, and that a comprehensive strategic response was required before any further engagement was authorized. The informal conclusion, spoken by Councillor Mareth Deven near the end of the session, was not challenged by anyone present, and its absence from the record was not accidental. What Mareth Deven said was, "We do not know what else they have, and I want you all to understand what that means. It means we are not currently planning a response to a known threat. We are planning a response to civilization we have been watching for 200 years without actually seeing. And the thing that frightens me is not the ship. The thing that frightens me is that they built it while we were watching and we didn't notice, which means either our surveillance was fundamentally inadequate or they hid it so well that adequacy was irrelevant. And I don't know which of those possibilities is worse." Nobody answered him, because the answer was obvious and the obvious answer was not the reassuring one. Neither possibility was worse. They were both terrible in different ways. The first meant the Empire's intelligence infrastructure had a catastrophic blind spot. The second meant humanity had spent 50 years demonstrating, in the most patient and complete way imaginable, that they were capable of hiding things from a civilization that had been actively looking. What Mareth Deven did not say, because he didn't yet have the information, was the question that would have completed his logic. If they built that while you were watching, what have they been building while you were busy thinking about that? The persistent horizon moved to the inner system boundary on a Thursday ship time. Maury stood her watch on the command deck, 14 hours on, 2 off, the same rhythm she had maintained for 19 months. The stars through the viewport were different now, closer to Earth's sun, which was visible as a distinct bright point, and she found herself looking at it more than she usually allowed herself to. She had a policy against looking at it too often because it made the distance feel specific rather than abstract, and specific distance was harder to carry than abstract distance, and she had enough to carry. The Varath did not respond to the persistent horizon's repositioning with another fleet. They responded with something that took Maury almost a week to understand was a response. They withdrew. Quietly over the course of several days, the monitoring posts on the outer survey boundary, the ones that hadn't already been quietly, systematically cut off in the weeks before the engagement, went dark. Not destroyed, withdrawn. The Varath were pulling their surveillance assets back in a way that a certain kind of analysis would read as retreat and a different kind of analysis would read as something else entirely. Maury was the kind who did the second analysis. She had always been the second kind. "They're not retreating," she told Aldrin. "They're recalibrating. There's a difference." "What's the difference for us?" She thought about it. "A force that retreats is a force that's decided it can't win this engagement. A force that recalibrates is a force that's decided it doesn't have enough information yet." She paused. "The second one is more dangerous." He considered that. Because they'll come back," she said, "when they think they understand us better, and next time they won't use a survey fleet." He looked at the viewport, Earth's sun bright and small and very far away from where they were standing. "Then what was the point of this?" he asked, quietly. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question, the kind that deserves a real answer from someone who has thought about it enough to have one. Maury had thought about it for 19 months. She had thought about it in the cold, in the dark, with her hands on the hull. She had thought about it during the engagement, while her hands confirmed targeting solutions for 43 ships and their crews, carrying the weight of it the way she had decided she would always carry these things, fully without putting it down, because putting it down was the thing she wasn't willing to do. "The point," she said, "is that they know we exist now in a specific way, not as a pre-fold species on a monitoring list, as something they don't have a category for." She looked at the sun. "The Varath think in categories. They always have everything they've ever done with new civilizations, everything we know about their diplomatic history, their expansion doctrine, their intelligence models. It's all categorical. You assess, you classify, you respond according to classification. We spent 200 years in the wrong category, now we're not. And that's better, it's scarier," she said, "which is what we needed." She paused. "Not because we want them afraid. Because afraid is a category too. And fear means they'll think carefully before they act, and careful means time, and time is the only thing." She stopped. She thought about what she was about to say and whether it was true enough to say out loud in words where it would be real. "Time is the only thing we were always sure we could use better than them," she finished. Aldrin didn't say anything for a while. "Then you think this works?" Maury thought about 50 years of building. She thought about 41,000 people who had signed up to live in the cold and the dark in a rock in the outer system of their own home. She thought about the debate she didn't know about, 12 years ago, where people had argued in a room about whether to build more than one. She thought about the 9 names she would recite at 1800. "I think," she said slowly, "that we were always going to do this whether it worked or not. And that's the thing about us that they still don't understand." She turned away from the viewport. They think we built the persistent horizon because we thought it would win, but we built it because we thought we had to. She went back to her station. The winning was always secondary, the commitment came first. Sethak Vorin spent the rest of his career trying to finish the sentence that Marath Deven had started. He read everything, every broadcast fragment, every translated communication. Every piece of data that Survey Post 11C3 had collected across 200 years, most of which had been filed and forgot, and which now, read backward through the knowledge of what it had been leading to, formed a picture that he found he could look at only for short periods before needing to set it down. What he saw when he looked at it was not what his training had told him civilizations looked like. His training had told him that pre-fold civilizations followed patterns, technological development curves, resource allocation norms, institutional behavior models that were, across a remarkably wide variety of species, surprisingly consistent. Development happened in stages. Capability followed investment. Investment followed threat assessment. The humans didn't follow the model. Not because they were ahead of the model or behind it, but because the model's foundational assumption, that a civilization invests in response to perceived threat, was simply wrong for them in a specific and important way. The humans had invested in anticipation of a threat they couldn't yet confirm existed. They had built a ship the size of a moon over 50 years in response to a possibility. A pattern they had noticed in the behavior of the one civilization they had the most data on. A civilization that had been watching them for 2 centuries. A civilization they had never met and never spoken to, and whose intentions they had assessed from the outside the same way a careful analyst assesses anything, by watching what it does and asking what it means. What the humans had concluded, from 200 years of watching the Varath watch them was, this will not end peacefully unless we are too costly to end. Not too powerful, not superior, too costly. Sethak Vorin set down the report that made this clear to him and sat in his office for a long time not moving, because the implication of it, fully followed, was not comforting. The implication was that the humans had never believed they could win a war with the Varath. They had believed, and had apparently believed consistently and across generations, that winning was not the point. The point was to make the cost of conflict unacceptable. The point was to ensure that any Varath strategic calculation done correctly would produce the answer. This is not worth it. He thought about his fleet. He thought about how perfectly, how efficiently, how completely that message had been delivered. And then, because he was good at his job and had survived to a senior position by being able to ask the next question even when the current question was still hurting him, he thought about what Thessel had said. The debate wasn't about whether to build the persistent horizon, it was about whether to build more than one. He picked up his communicator, he called Thessel. She answered immediately because she always did. The debate, he said, the 12-year-old recording, was there any indication of what they decided? Silence, not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who had already thought about it and had been wondering how long before he asked. The translation system flagged a fragment at the very end of what we recovered, she said. It came after what I initially thought was the conclusion, a different voice, shorter, she paused. It reads as a procedural motion, a vote. The result, the word the translation system flags for approved, she said, with a secondary notation indicating a supermajority. Sethak Vorin looked at the stars outside his viewport. Somewhere out there, at the inner boundary of a system the Varath had monitored for 200 years without seeing, a vessel the size of a moon was sitting at the edge of human space, cold and dark and very, very patient, the way things that have been waiting a long time are patient, not with peace but with purpose, not with comfort but with the particular stillness of something that has already decided, and is simply waiting for the moment to make the decision real. He thought about the 43 ships. He thought about Velkarath, who had done the right thing and died for it. He thought about 7,400 crew who had never known what they were looking at. He thought about what a civilization willing to build one was willing to do if it had decided on more. And for the first time in his career, for the first time in a career built on the solid foundation of the Varath Empire's certainty about its place in the galaxy, he did not reach for the next step in the standard protocol. He sat with the uncertainty. He let it be the size it actually was rather than the smaller, more manageable size that protocol existed to make it feel like. He thought about humans spending 50 years in the cold. He thought about a crew of 41,000 who had come out of the dark not to conquer, not to demonstrate, not to announce themselves, but simply to ensure that a certain calculation run by a certain empire that had filed them in the wrong category for 2 centuries came out to the right answer. He thought about how they had gone back to silence afterward, moved to display, not pursued, 50 years of building, and when it was over they went quiet again. The Varath had a concept for a civilization that fought when it had to and stopped when the point was made. It was a tactical category, a rational behavioral model, a predictable pattern. This was not that. This was something the category didn't touch. Something that had planned not just the ship and the engagement and the withdrawal, but the silence after the withdrawal and the message of the silence, and the effect of the message on a species that operated on assessments and categories, and the comforting certainty that anything sufficiently watched was sufficiently understood. The message of the silence was not "we are done." The message was something harder and quieter and much more permanent. We were here the whole time. We were always here. And you are now running a very different calculation than the one you ran yesterday. And the calculation you ran yesterday is the one we built this to change. Sethak Voran pulled up the star chart. He looked at Outer Survey Grid 11. He looked at the system with the small yellow star and the third planet blue, green, and bright, where a species he had once understood as developing standard trajectory was doing whatever it was doing with the time that his empire had just handed it. He thought about the vote. Supermajority approved. He turned off the star chart. He did not sleep that night, not because he was afraid of what humanity would do next. He was afraid of something more foundational, more complete, more difficult to address with any protocol or any plan. He was afraid because he understood finally and fully that the humans had never once, not across 50 years of building, not across 19 months of hiding, not across 11 minutes of engagement, never once needed to hate the Verath to do what they did. They had not been driven by rage or vengeance or the hot, legible emotion that every Verath strategic model understood as the fuel of existential conflict. They had been driven by something colder, quieter, more durable. They had looked at a galaxy that hadn't noticed them yet, and they had decided calmly in meetings by supermajority vote what they were willing to pay to make sure that when the galaxy did notice, it would choose to keep looking rather than stop. Not the strongest species. Not the fastest. Not the most advanced. Not chosen by any force larger than their own very human capacity to look at the worst possible answer and decide collectively that they would pay the price of a better one. The kind of species that does not stop. Not because it can't be stopped, because it decided not to be.